Tales of Witchcraft in Putnam County, Tennessee is a topic that I was thrilled to start investigating. Interestingly enough, this story was not at all what I expected it to be. Hey cousin, welcome to Hate and Holler Podcast. I'm Dee, your guide through the strange and unusual in the South. And today's story about the witch of Putnam County and the strange graves of witches is going to be a little different. I am not scripted today. Instead, I wanted to share these stories with you conversationally and tell them in a way that shares my opinions on them. Because this is very opinion focused, I didn't think telling them in my usual storytelling manner would get that focus across. So, if you enjoy this style of podcast, please be sure to let me know and hit that subscribe button and let me know if you would like this style a little bit more in the future or if you just prefer my scripted methods. So let's begin with the beginning. When I was looking for some strange stories in my nearby area that I can go and investigate personally with some boots on the ground methods rather than online research and by the phone, I ran across what was called the Witches Cemetery in Putnam County. Putnam County is not very far from me, and I was actually pretty excited about this whole concept. I quickly realized, however, as soon as I began to investigate, that it was a lot of hubbub drummed up by ignorance. The graves, which were said to be of witches buried in the 1800s, are called that only because of they're kind of strange looking. They're comb graves, and I highly recommend you look it up. If you join my Patreon, I have shared some information about them. But comb graves were all the rage, if you can call cemetery and burial fads that. They are like little roofs, little A-frame rooftops over the graves, and they're made out of slate or concrete or other materials, and they protect the graves, which has come in helpful for genealogists and historians and people who do like find a grave, because a lot of country cemeteries get overgrown if the person taking care of them has died or moved on. And when they become overgrown and weather and all that, it can become very hard to find some tombstones. So when they are comb graves, that's a lot more stone to protect the area, and you can definitely see where the dimensions of that grave are for restoration. So that's really cool. If you're into morbid history like I am, I really recommend you check out comb graves. They originated in Tennessee, and Tennessee has the most of them, but you can find them in other areas in the South and Appalachia region. But this particular cemetery in Putnam County that's called the Witches Cemetery not only has comb graves, but the headstones have pentagrams on them, including an inverted pentagram, which means an upside down one. And you can find blog posts and vlogs about the Witches Cemetery where people are talking about how the pentagram is a sign of a witch, and an upside down pentagram is a bad witch, whereas a right side up one is a good witch, and so on and so forth. A lot of that is ignorance. These specific pentagrams on these tombstones are actually from Masonic and Eastern Star organizations and communities. There's nothing witchcraft about it unless you want to argue that Masons practice witchcraft, which you could. If you go back far enough, it has roots in the Golden Dawn and all that, which is high magic. So, but these particular people, including one that is of a very young child, weren't witches. They were Masons or Eastern Star or relatives of them. And the star is put on there usually as a sign of that organization. Other cemetery references for symbols said that the star also is a symbol of the undying light of the spirit. So there's lots of reason for stars on tombstones. In fact, the connection of witchcraft to the pentacle or pentagram is a lot more modern, and I would not assume that a person buried under a headstone with a pentacle on it was a witch unless it was a modern headstone. It wasn't a Masonic pentacle, but was a bit more of a modern, like a Wiccan pentacle. And you can find Wiccan pentacles on stones of a lot of Wiccan soldiers and the like who have chosen that symbol to go on their headstone. Anyway, all that to say that the Witches Cemetery in Putnam County is just not a witches cemetery. What's cool about it, though, besides the comb graves, which was just a really fun rabbit hole to go down to, is when I was researching the Witches Cemetery, I was watching a video and scrolling through the comments, and I found in the comments somebody say, this is fake, obviously, it's not a real witch, it's fake in that it's not a witch's cemetery, it's not a fake cemetery, but that there is a story about a witch in Putnam County, and it's the story of the Buckner witch. Intrigued, I did my research. The Buckner witch is actually a bit of a misnomer. It's called that because the people who saw the ghost of the witch were the Buckner family. The witch herself, or the woman that was called a witch, was Paulie Brewington. And the story about them is as follows. According to The Ghost and Haunts of Tennessee by Christopher K. Coleman. And this was shared on Fairweather Lewis blog. And you can find all my links on the Hate and Holler website in my transcript, as well as on Patreon, where you can link right to my research. Paulie Brewington, the story goes, showed up in Putnam County, Tennessee, in company with her two brothers sometime after the Civil War. No one ever learned where they came from or who they might be related to, always important information to the natives of small southern towns. The three simply arrived in tiny Monterey one day, moved into a small house near an abandoned sawmill. Paulie Brewington was a small woman, dark-skinned, dark-haired, dark-eyed, middle-aged, and unmarried. Her chief eccentricity was that she always dressed head to toe in black. Only leavening in her wardrobe was the occasional white collar or cuffs. Her bonnets were black, and so was her purse she always carried. The Brewingtons were desperately poor, and to earn money, Paulie hired out as a maid. She worked for several families in the area before taking a job with a couple. Here they're called Alec and Margaret Buckner, but the names tend to change later on. Mr. Buckner was some years younger than Paulie, but that did not stop the woman in black from falling in love with him with all the passion and jealousy of a much younger woman. She tried with all her might to break up his marriage by whatever means necessary. Mr. Buckner was in love with his wife, and Paulie was eventually dismissed from their employ. Margaret Buckner gave birth to a son in December of 1881. A few days after this blessed event, while visiting the neighbors, Margaret interrupted an animated conversation with a non sequitur, "Well, the old witch is dead." The ladies, startled, asked her to explain. Margaret's face grew somber as she told them that she meant Paulie Brewington. Paulie was dead, then she added, "and now she's come to haunt me." The story goes on that Margaret Buckner became very paranoid about Paulie Brewington's ghost, to the point where she would not go to bed without sweeping her broom under the bed to make sure Paulie wasn't there, and would often wake up to see Paulie Brewington in bed between her and her husband, and that she saw Paulie Brewington's ghost nearly constantly until the day she died, even after her husband's death, which was years before she died herself. Later, other couples saw what they believed to be the ghost of Paulie Brewington. While that's an interesting story, I was more intrigued by what I found while researching the background of it. I looked into Paulie Brewington, and I found what is believed to be her grave. This is interesting because in the original story, Paulie Brewington's grave was said not to be in Putnam County. Instead, that her brothers had carried her body off and were never seen in the area again because of mysterious circumstances around Paulie's death and the whispers that Paulie was a witch. What I thought was so interesting about finding this grave is it's in Putnam County, which is where the story comes from. And on Find a Grave, it is a starred grave. It has an inverted star, and it is a comb grave. It is not in the same cemetery as said to be Witch's Cemetery, but it is for Mary Paulie Brewington. The spelling was different than the one in the story. The reason I believe this to be her grave is because the descendant of Paulie Brewington says it is. Her descendant explains that there are some interesting situations around her headstone. The misspelling is just from the fact that spelling of names was not across the board the same until more recently, when people became more literate, when documentation became more of a thing. So anybody who goes into history or genealogy will find that name spellings will vary, as will nicknames, middle names, and so on. In this case, what I thought was interesting is that there is no date of birth. A lot of people believed that this meant that this grave was for a stillborn child, because it only has the date of death. However, her descendant says that there was no date of birth on there either because it wasn't known. Not everybody knew when they were born, but that he attributes it to a death in 1882 to a Mary Paulie Brewington, who was aged 51 or 52 years old. What was very interesting to me is that he attributes her to having 6 children, the last of which, her last child was a child of her employer, Mr. Buckner. That flavors the story that is told about the witch of Putnam County a whole lot differently. Another thing that changes the story is that her descendant says that she had sisters in the area who were, all of these women were Native American. As to the tribe that they belong to or the group that they belong to, it varies. Some say it's Cherokee, some say it's, and I apologize if I'm pronouncing this wrong, Kahari. But that because they were Native, that they were not given many employment opportunities. And so to get by, these women became sex workers, including Paulie. And that she then became a maid and had a child to Mr. Buckner. Now, with that in mind, knowing that she was a Native woman, knowing that she had a history, knowing that she had children to take care of, was getting older, and that her employer had a child by her, I don't think that I can possibly believe that she was this love-crazed, obsessed, jealous woman who became obsessed with her employer. I think it's far more likely that the story went around after she gave birth to her employer's child and was kicked out by the wife, who was also pregnant. I can't imagine that would have been an easy living arrangement. And she died, it seems, right around the same time as Margaret's child being born, as well as, it seems, her own. So it's just an interesting story. I haven't found any proof that she's a witch other than the fact that supposedly she wore black and she was native. So was she a witch, or was she simply a native woman practicing her own belief system or her own bodily autonomy to obtain money that she desperately needed for her family? This also brings up to me the idea of Margaret Buckner and dealing with her obsession over seeing Paulie Brewington's ghost. If this story is true, that she did see the ghost and was obsessed and haunted by Paulie Brewington to her last days, if Paulie Brewington was wrongfully treated and wrongfully removed from employment and then died, is it Margaret Buckner's guilt around the situation that caused her to see Paulie Brewington over and over again, to a point of being afraid to even go in bed without checking under her bed like a child? And then it makes me question that there was no explanation of why Paulie Brewington died. Her last son that was born to Buckner was not born at her date of death. So this leads me to believe that something else happened. And her descendant also said that there might have been omissions in the tombstone to keep people from bothering the grave because people believed her to be a witch at the time. Or, if not a witch, a woman of ill repute, and would have not wanted her buried where she was. He goes on to say, I believe all these attempts to disguise this grave was to keep it from being desecrated by some people that thought badly of her. I refer you to the Buckner Witch stories of Standing Stone, Tennessee, now called Monterey, Tennessee. He said, I totally believe this is Mary Paulie Brewington, aka the Buckner Witch, also my great-grandmother, God bless her soul. And to me, it's a sad story. It's not a creepy, spooky Halloween story. It's a story that is sadly of a woman who was doing her best to take care of her family. And in death, her reputation went on to turn her into something questionable, other than a woman just doing what she had to do. I find it more questionable that Margaret Buckner saw her until the day she died. It makes me want to find out, was Paulie Brewington murdered? Like, that's where my brain's going. Was she murdered by Margaret Buckner for having a relationship with her husband? Because that would certainly create a lot of guilt in somebody. Or if not guilt, that would definitely cause somebody to be haunted. And then if that's the case, if there are couples that are seeing Paulie Brewington nowadays, is there something going on between them? Perhaps that's horror movie junkie in me, that I want to see the whole, there's a reason behind it, and there's comeuppance and all that other stuff, It makes me think of the Bell Witch movie, where the ghost of the girl visits the modern day family to warn them that what happened to her is happening to the daughter of the modern day family. Things like that. Like, I know that real life hauntings are not cut and dry, but it automatically, of course, is where my brain is going. I would love to know your opinions on this. If you've heard of the Putnam County or the Buckner Witch, I just like calling her the Buckner Witch because I think it gives too much focus on the family and not on Paulie Brewington herself, who, by story or by genealogy, I cannot find any reason why she was called a witch. Nowadays, seeing a woman dressed in all black at all times would mean either she's, goth or something's up. But in the 1800s, if she was mourning anybody, and it sounds like she had several children not make it, perhaps, that, she would wear black. It was expected to stay in mourning. Or it could very well be that that's what she could afford to wear. This is pre-washing machine dry cleaning days. And as a working woman, she probably had to wear what she could that wasn't going to fall apart while she was scrubbing floors and being a maid in this house of the Buckners. But like I said, I would love to know your opinions on the story. I came away from it believing that Paulie Brewington is just a misrepresented, ill-treated woman of her time, and that her memory should be more of a solemn thing than something to carry on spookiness. And I hope that going forward that these graves, these beautiful comb graves with the stars on them, will be treated well. So if you do decide to go and check out the Witches Cemetery or Paulie Brewington's grave, which is in Bohannon Cemetery, that you do so respectfully and with honor to the people who are resting there and their descendants. But yes, please feel free to subscribe and to let me know what you think of this story. This is an interesting one in my opinion because the history of it is so real and so sad and different than a lot of the ghost stories I research for this podcast. Thank you for listening to tonight's podcast. Be sure to hit that subscribe button. And if you want to see what goes on behind the scenes and see where I get my research done for these stories, head on over to our Patreon. Every dollar helps keep the mic recording. Thanks again for listening to Hate and Holler Podcast.